Multiple views cleanup. So far, we've got multiple views on the same page, but there are a lot of little problems that need to be addressed. In the visual presentation, these marks need to be moved to the bottom. We should also work on their style and bring back their axes. And the code itself at this point is feeling a bit tight, I would say. The complexity is growing and we're in need of a refactoring. I'm feeling some tension, namely because there's so many files here, and also we've got two components defined in our data histogram module because the file marks.js is already taken. So let's work on some of those things. The first thing I'll focus on is moving the marks down to the bottom of the screen. In datahistogram.js, we're defining width and height. What if I just change this height value to be something small? 50 doesn't work because the top and bottom margins are larger than that. So what if I say 100? All right, now we've got these marks up here, but I'd like these to be at the bottom instead. Let's review how these are assembled in index.js. We've got our SVG element that contains both the bubble map and the data histogram. This is just one of many approaches that you can take to putting multiple views on a single page. Other approaches include having multiple SVG elements that are inside divs, perhaps. You need to do it that way if you're integrating with different tools that don't use SVG, like, I don't know, WebGL, 3.js, or something like that. But in our case, since both views are using SVG, I think this is the simplest way. Since we're in the world of SVG, probably the easiest thing to do is just to put the date histogram into a group element and translate that group element to be at the bottom of the screen. Let's try that. We can just create a new group element and set the transform of this group element to be translate 0 in the x direction and some number in the y direction, maybe 400. All right, that moved it down to the bottom. Rather than hard coding constants like 400 and 100 for the height, I'd like to come up with sort of a framework of sorts for coming up with these values. Ideally, we could just specify what percentage of the vertical height is taken up by the bottom view, and then derive all of these height values from that. In index.js, we've got width and height of the entire page. I'll introduce a new variable called data histogram size, and this is going to be the vertical percentage or ratio of the height that the data histogram will take up. So if I set it to 0.2, that means the data histogram should take up 20% on the bottom. Now we can derive this number by taking date histogram size and multiplying it by our height. This would actually be 20% from the top, but since it's from the bottom, we need to say height minus that. Then we can pass in this value, date histogram size times height, into our date histogram component as height. That way we could tweak the size just from right here and everything would sort of flow from that. But I don't believe height is yet being used as a prop in date histogram. Instead of hard coding the height here to be 100, we can unpack height as a prop right here in our date histogram component. Now the only reason why it's not filling up the bottom is because of our margin. So I'll just make the margins a bit smaller for the top and the bottom. All right, this looks pretty good. All right, now that we've pretty much addressed the positioning aspect of this, let's address some of the internal code cleanup that needs to be done. As it stands, we've got a couple modules that relate to the map and a couple modules that relate to the date histogram, and we're going to need to add more, namely the axes, for the date histogram. So instead of just letting these files pile up, let's introduce some directories to organize our modules. Let's start by putting all the map-related stuff into its own directory. The main module for the map is bubblemap.js. In VizHub, I can just put this into a directory called bubble map by just adding a slash here, and then I can name the file index.js. Now we've got this directory called bubble map that has index.js inside of it. Now in our top level file, index.js, we can explicitly import that file by saying import bubble map from /bubble-map/index.js. Now we're getting an error that says bubble map/marks does not exist. That makes perfect sense because index.js is trying to import /marks. The / means look in the current directory that I'm in this case, the bubble map directory. But our marks.js is out here. We can move marks.js into the bubble map directory by just renaming it to bubble map/marks.js. All right, now everything's back in working order. All right, that's how you can refactor some modules into a directory. Let's do the same now for datehistogram. I can rename datehistogram to be datehistogram the directory /index.js. Update our index.js to import from that file. And now we're back in working order, and we have a place now that we can put all of our other modules related to the date histogram. Now we're ready to bring back the date histogram axes. Over in the original date histogram example, we've got these components axis bottom and axis left. I'm going to copy this axis bottom code, make a new file called datehistogram/axisbottom.js. Whoops, there was a typo there. That should be DATE histogram. And then I can paste that logic into here. And I'll go through the same process for axis left. Make a new file, datehistogram/axis-left.js, and then paste that logic there. Now we need to use these inside of datehistogram/index.js. So I can go back to the original datehistogram example, index.js, and then I'll look at the imports. I can just copy these imports of axis bottom and axis left and paste them into here. And this works because // looks for the module in the directory that we're currently inside of. So it's going to resolve to these two files here. Next, I'll look for the logic that actually uses those axes components. It's down here at the bottom. Inside of our group element, we're putting the y-axis and the x-axis along with their labels. I'll copy all of that and paste it into our date histogram component inside of our group element right here. Y-axis label offset is not defined. Yeah, there are a couple of definitions that we're going to need from the original, including these label offsets. So I'll paste those into our module. And we're getting some progress, see that? And no more errors. Great, so now we can work on the styling of these. In our styles.css, we only have the styles for the map marks and the circles. So I'm going to add a section for the date histogram marks. And we can look back at the original date histogram styles, and we can just copy all the related styles for the ticks and the marks and the axis labels over into our new example, styles.css. And check it out, now that's looking a lot better. It's still a bit problematic though because this label is way too big. But that's alright, we can just change the font size of our axis label to be something small. 0.5 looks pretty good. The label fits now in that little space. Now the tick marks are a bit too big. I mean the tick text is a bit too big. So we can set the font size of our tick text, which until now is just using the default size. 0.5 EM looks reasonable for that as well. The 0 on the bottom is getting cut off. I think that's just an issue of our margin. So in our data histogram index.js, we can just tweak our margin to add a little bit of bottom margin, let's say 10 pixels. Looks like we need a little more than that, maybe 20 pixels. All right, now we're getting some reasonable looking spacing for the bottom. There is a little too much white space over here, so let's tweak the left margin to be, let's say, 60. And now the axis text is too far away from those tick marks. And that spacing is defined by these variables here, x and y axis label offset. I want to tweak these at the same time that I'm tweaking the margin. So I'm going to move those to be up in the same place where the margin is defined, just for ease of tweakability. Now we can change the y-axis label offset to be, let's say, 30. Okay, that brought it in pretty nicely. Now we can decrease the left margin even more. Okay, this is starting to come together. One thing that doesn't quite feel right is that these tick mark grid lines are much darker than the gradicules on the map. I feel like they should sort of be the same color. That's just a styling issue that we can address in styles.css, where the marks gradicules, this same style could apply to our tick lines. So I'm going to cut that selector and delete that block of CSS that we had. And then I'm going to add a comma and then paste that selector. And in CSS, what a comma does is it means, okay, select this category of elements and also select this category of elements and apply these styles to both groups at the same time. Now, if we take a closer look, we can see that these grid lines are the same color as these background gradicules. There's still a little bit of visual confusion because the map is visible in the background of this chart, and it's cool in a way, but it's also kind of confusing. I think what I would like to see instead is that the background of this bottom chart should be white, so that this area of screen real estate is clearly claimed by the data histogram, and no portion of the map down here should be visible. Probably the easiest way to accomplish that would be to add a white rectangle behind those marks. So I think I'll try that. In our data histogram index.js, when we render these things, inside of this group element, before any of these other elements, I can add a rect. X and Y of this rect should be 0, which are the defaults, so we don't even need to explicitly specify any X or Y, but we do need to specify width and height. The width of this rectangle will be the width of the entire page. So I'd like to just use width here, which should be a prop passed in along with height. But before I leave this rectangle, I want to also get down the thought of height should be height. And now let's address that issue of width. Width, where is width defined right now? It's hard-coded here in this file as being 960, but I would really prefer if that were passed in as a prop to our data histogram along with height. So data histogram can have props data, width, and height. And then in index.js, we need to pass in width into our data histogram as a prop. Width equals width. All right, we're getting a black rectangle, but it seems to be inside of the inner rectangle, which is not the place where it should be. So in data histogram index.js, instead of putting the rect inside of this group element, which is translated by the margin left and top, we can keep this rectangle outside of this group element. And now we face this error, elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. That makes sense because we're just returning two top-level elements. We can solve that by returning a JSX fragment that contains both our rectangle and our group element. So I'll close out that fragment here. And now the rectangle is just where it should be. By default, the rectangle is black, but we can set the fill to be white instead. All right, now we've got this nice clean separation between these two different views. The map is getting cut off at the bottom, but I think that's acceptable because for this data set, there are no data points that fall beneath that line. We're almost done. One of the original motivations for introducing these directories was the fact that we have our marks component defined here inside of datehistogram index.js. What I would like to do is move this logic to a file called marks.js inside of the datehistogram directory. So I'll create a new file called datehistogram/marks.js. I'll paste that logic for our marks into there. And then in datehistogram index.js, we need to import marks from /marks. And it works again. All right, sweet. Would you look at that? All right, that's how you can position multiple views within a single SVG element and refactor the code into directories and modules to accommodate scaling of complexity. To recap what we did here, in our index.js, the top level of our program, we're defining a new variable called datehistogram size. It's set to 0.2 right now, which means it takes up 20% of the screen on the bottom. If we were to change this to, say, 0.5, then the datehistogram would take up half of the screen. In our app component, we're putting both of these views in a single SVG. The bubble map is taking up the entire SVG, and the datehistogram is on the bottom. And it's moved down to the bottom by the transform on this enclosing group element. We're figuring out the height of the datehistogram by multiplying the height of the SVG by datehistogram size. We're passing that in as the height prop of our datehistogram, and we're translating the enclosing group element by height minus that, which gives us the y coordinate for the top of this rectangle here. We're also passing data and width into our datehistogram component. Datehistogram and bubble map are imported from their respective directories. Putting code into directories makes the top level set of files easier to read and interpret because the top level stuff is visible here at the top level directory, and then all the bubble map related modules are inside of the bubble map directory, and all the datehistogram related modules are inside of the datehistogram directory. One benefit that directories gives us is that we can have modules of the same name, for example marks.js, in both directories. This comes in handy because you can come up with names for modules that make sense only within the context of that directory. Otherwise, you'd need to come up with schemes like long naming schemes like, bubble map marks and then datehistogram marks, which just is not manageable after a certain level of depth. But anyway, bubble map is imported from /bubblemapp/index.js. And in that file, the marks module is imported from /marks. The / means relative to where this file is, it's going to look for another file called marks. So /marks in bubblemap/index.js will resolve to this module here, the sibling of index.js inside of the bubble map directory. And the logic inside of these modules is just the same as it was before. We just pretty much moved it around. And then finally, we did a little bit of tweaking to the CSS. The main new concept that we used here is the comma in CSS, which essentially takes the union of two sets. In this case, our graticules inside of our marks and our lines inside of our ticks. Oh, and we also added that white background rectangle inside of datehistogram/index.js. This rectangle makes it so that you can't see through to the map. And because all React components must return exactly one top-level element, we had to put our rectangle and our group inside of a React fragment. React fragments are pretty much just to solve this problem, and they don't end up rendering any DOM elements out. It's just for React to internally manage its components. All right, that's how you can clean up multiple views. That's all for Analyzing Missing Migrants Part 4, Multiple Views Cleanup.